Genesis does what Nintendo don't. You know, the coolest thing about that slogan was that it was true, and not as a knock on Nintendo or anything. It was just that the Genesis and Super Nintendo were both very different consoles. And when it came to Disney games, you could put it another way. Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't right now, but certainly used to. Although, not quite as catchy. See, one of the trademarks of the Nintendo Entertainment System was that it had some genuinely awesome Disney games, mostly thanks to Capcom. There was Rescue Rangers, DuckTales, Darkwing Duck. I mean, the NES carried the Disney flag for years, but when the time came to pass it on, it was actually Sega's Genesis that picked it back up. It had Quackshot, Mickey Mania, and of course, Castle of Illusion. Everyone talks about Castle of Illusion, and with good reason. It might be the best Mickey Mouse game of all time, but often overlooked and lost in that game's huge shadow is this one. It might not be Castle of Illusion, but World of Illusion is another one of those Disney classics on the Sega Genesis. Released in 1992, World of Illusion came 2 years after its landmark predecessor. Let's talk about starting strong. Sega's Illusion series only had 2 Genesis games, and they were both outstanding. Sadly, that's also where the magic carpet ride would end. I mean, there was a Game Gear game and some Master System stuff, but there was never another Illusion game released for the Sega Genesis. This would be the swan song. And as premature as that might have been, it was a hell of a way to go out. So, in some ways, World of Illusion picks up right where Castle of Illusion left off. It's another 2D platformer in which Mickey has to fight through lots of magic, and of course, lots of illusions. But the thing is, it's also quite different. It looks different, plays different. I mean, in a sense, it's almost like the Doki Doki Panic to Castle of Illusion Super Mario. Well, not that extreme, but at least there's no turnips. So, first and foremost, you get to select a character. This time Donald Duck is along for the ride. And when you start the game, you get to pick which one you want to play. And while they're both functionally similar, the game does change depending on which one you go with. If you play as Donald, you'll actually get to see levels that Mickey doesn't, and vice versa. In fact, there are even levels that you only get to see in co-op, which is awesome. And speaking of the levels, man, World of Illusion has some really cool levels. And they're actually broken into several pieces, so they never overstay their welcome. Seems like you're always being taken to a strange new location, where surreal backgrounds and classic Disney references collide head-on, and beautiful colors just eject from the impact point. And what I'm saying is, World of Illusion's a very pretty game. Its levels are a joy to play through, and they have just the right difficulty, enough that you'll have to retry certain parts a few times, but never so much that you get frustrated and it stops being fun. But another change from Castle of Illusion is that the game abandons one of the staple mechanics of a platformer. In another very Doki Doki move, you can't jump on enemies in this game. Instead, you have a magical cape, which you can use to transform your enemies into less dangerous things. Flowers, butterflies. Again, big difference from Castle of Illusion. And even the platforming has a different feel. I mean, in comparison, Castle of Illusion has more of a traditional Mario-type feel. But World of Illusion doesn't feel very Mario at all. So even though there are aesthetic and some general gameplay similarities to Castle of Illusion, this one's definitely its own game. And it's a perfect amount of different for a sequel to have. But what it does carry over is that classic Castle of Illusion weirdness, that surreal, wonderfully strange vibe. That's all here. It's like a storybook that's been, twisted in some way, which is a perfect concept for these characters. So the presentation and music, it's all top-notch. And even though the art might be a bit better in Castle of Illusion, this one has its perks too. Specifically, some really beautiful animations and sprite work. In a way, the Illusion series has always been kind of a tragic one. It produced 2 of the best Disney games ever, and 2 of the best Genesis games, really. But then it sort of closed the book, which is a real shame. And I think that might be why this one gets overlooked at times. Had there been more Illusion games, it might have been different, but when there's only 2, Obviously, one has to be the favorite. Just don't let that keep you from jumping into this illusion too. And big thanks to our friend Ahmet from Springfield Gardens, New York, for sending us World of Illusion. It may forever be the other illusion, but it's a classic all the same.